So up next, a composer and artist and assistant professor of visual studies at the Daniels faculty. Mitchell Akiyama has written scores for films and dance performances and created installations that interrogate our ideas of perception and sensory experience. His writing explores contemporary art, animals, and cities. And tonight he's going to speak about crystals, and no, I'm not talking about the New Age kind, but the crystal that's essential to the functioning of countless devices that we use every day. Mitchell's interested in how the metaphors we create affect our perception of technology. And the crystal is a metaphor that has a clear impact on the way we see the role of technology in our world. Mitchell, the floor is yours.
Whoops. Sorry. Okay, so to start, I'd like to have you do something that is a little strange and out of context for a situation like this. I'd like you all to take out your phones, please, and turn them on and hold them up like you're at a Bon Jovi concert with a fake lighter. Now what I want you to do is I want you to imagine all of the physical objects that phone's replaced. The calendars, the encyclopedias, the cameras, the televisions. Imagine that room full of stuff. And now what I want you to do is imagine the inside of your phone. Where are all those things residing inside your phone? What do you think of when you visualize the inside of your phone? Something like this, maybe?
In 2 months, the wafer is ready. Huge integrated circuits consisting of conductors with a length of multiple kilometers link up 100 billion transistors on numerous levels. And that in a space no larger than a fingernail.
So, minus the cheesy strings and the voiceover, that's actually kind of exactly what I see when I imagine the insides of electronics. These orb-like electrons shooting around this copper maze. Now, the thing is, where is the pictures of your loved one? Where was your favorite song in that mess of wires and electrons? Of course, we have to translate those phenomena into things that make sense to us, into images and sounds. And I'm going to call this transformation, this translation, kind of a metaphor. So I know that metaphors are usually figured as figures of speech or expressions, but I think that we can call a metaphor anything that helps us to understand something other than itself, anything that helps us to understand a different thing. So the thing about metaphors in our world of accelerated technological development is that they're helping us understand how these technologies inhabit our world and what their consequences and meanings are for us. So, for example, one of the most pervasive ones these days is the cloud. So the cloud has this effect of having you imagine that your personal information just sort of vaporizes and drifts up into the sky, and it's immaterial and ubiquitous. But I think it's clearly, your phone, your computer, all these things are material things. And a metaphor like a cloud distracts us from the very, very real physical, environmental effects that using these kinds of technologies have. So, for example, the cloud has to reside somewhere in physical space. This is an image of a Google data center in Oregon, and you see these the cooling towers vaporizing water that's emerging and blending into the clouds. And I think this image is a really fitting description of what I want to talk about today, which is how I think that metaphors and materials are starting to collapse into each other to the point where it's really hard to tell the difference. So here we have an image of a data center quite literally creating its own weather in a sense. You have this cloud sort of vaporizing into the actual cloud. But the thing is now we understand weather more and more through data modeling. But where did those data models get housed? In the cloud, which is housed in the data center, which is generating vapor, which is creating its own weather. So you see this tightening spiral of materials and metaphors and stories and objects, and it's getting really, really hard to tell the difference between the two. So I want to take a little swerve here to what Nora was referring to, and I'm going to get a little new agey. I want to talk about crystals. So this is a Rochelle salt, which is a piezoelectric crystal. And what that means is when you apply pressure to it, it generates a current, an electrical current. And then conversely, when you run an electrical current through it, it changes shape. So what happens is when you make it oscillate really quickly through changing the polarity of these signals, it vibrates. And the reverse is true. It can transduce vibrations into electricity. So it has all these applications, like it's in electric cigarette lighters and fetal ultrasound monitors, the autofocus system of your camera. But the most important and pervasive application is probably inside the microprocessors in your computers. It oscillates and regulates the amount of operations per second that your computer can affect. And crystals are also an important part of New Age healing technology. So this is some crystal healing. Now, the way that crystal healing works, and this is a pretty common explanation of it. This is from a website that sells healing crystal jewelry. So you have silicon dioxide in your body, and then when you put a crystal on your body, the silicon dioxide in the crystal resonates with that, the little subatomic particles or atomic particles in your body, and then that in turn corresponds in vibration with the universe. So it creates this energy alignment that centers you with the universe and heals you and gives you clear thought and stuff. But of course, there's no scientific proof for any of this. If there's an effect, it's probably a placebo. And what I think is interesting about this situation is that it seems to me as though crystals are being treated like technologies themselves. So a lot of crystal healers will say that people have been using this crystal technology since ancient Egypt. But there's really no evidence to suggest that there's any sort of like energetic understanding of crystals. In fact, people apparently didn't even really start using crystals for healing until the 1980s, at which point the personal computer and all sorts of other technological devices regulated by crystals were starting to become ubiquitous. So my sense is that in this situation, crystals are being treated like technologies, but they're only technologies when they're embedded in other systems of objects and practices that make them do something. So if you go to a crystal healing session and you put a crystal on your body, you're not sitting there with a technology on you. You're basically just lying underneath a metaphor. I'm going to take another swerve here. So this is the menu for an event I just catered. It was a launch party for this artwork that I did called The Elements of Exchange. And I prepared some homemade sourdough with sweat salt, and I served that with some homemade butter that was finished with sweat salt. There was an asparagus canapé, which was finished with urine salt. And there was a miso cookie with black sesame and tear salt, and a traditional German Gose, which is a salted ale that was also made with sweat salt. Here's some pictures of the spread. It was very tasty, if I say so myself. This is the asparagus urine canapé, and this is the miso tear cookie. So what drew me to the idea of salt for this project is that salt is a fundamental ingredient in human life. It regulates the fluid balance of the nervous system, of the circulatory system, and it brokers the exchange of ions across cell walls. And I'm sure my science is not, I know that there's some scientists here, and sorry. But what I find really interesting over and above that is that salt has traditionally and historically played a very similar role outside of the body. So you might know that salt apparently is humanity's oldest form of currency. And in fact, our word salary comes from the Latin root sal for salt because Roman soldiers were apparently paid in salt. I keep saying apparently and hedging because it's a bit controversial. We're not really sure if that's a misreading of history or not. But whether it is or not, I think it's totally fascinating that for a long, long time, we've had this sense of salt in the body and salt outside of the body is performing very, very similar functions, which are kind of metaphorical of each other. So I hope maybe you see a pattern emerging. It's hard to tell which level salt is operating on as a material and as a metaphor. So when I was talking about the menu, I know you didn't mishear me because you giggled. So yes, these salts were based on human body salts. And I didn't go to the gym and sweat into my shirt and wring it out into a cup or something. What I did was I synthesized these body salts based on the proportions of elements within the body, within each of these fluids and the solids within them. So the relative proportions of sodium and urea and potassium that mimicked or replicated the proportions of salt and tears and urine. So this is a sweat salt crystal, up close, microscopic. And this is urine salt. And so what was really interesting to me in developing this project was every time I explained it to people, every single person went, ugh, that's gross. Even when I explained that these were totally synthetic. I mean, the salts were made with over-the-counter, like completely edible things like table salt and potassium chloride and urea. And what was super interesting to me was that this reaction kind of sounded like what the French philosopher Julia Kristeva calls the abject. And what the abject is when your body is intact and integral, it seems correct and whole. But when we expel parts of our body, they become disgusting. They take on this liminal place that's associated with death and decay or something. And I think you can have a very clear, visceral example of this. So just take your fingernails and look at them, and maybe scratch your hand or scratch your neighbor, and admire your nails, and you might spend money on them and get them buffed and manicured. Now imagine clipping your fingernails and putting them into somebody's soup. Ugh. That's disgusting, but just a minute ago, they were a part of this like sensual, intimate potential. And so I think what's happening in my SALT project is that this metaphor, this story about the abjection of things that are apart from the body, that story is so powerful that it even extends to something that was never a part of a body at all. It's a story that's transformed basically table salt into something sweaty and disgusting. And so where I want to leave you today with is, don't think that there's a naivete in this that we haven't always used stories and metaphors to interpret the world. I mean, I think it's arguable that the Bible and folk tales, that things as old as humanity have been giving us ways of understanding what to eat and how to create laws and how to live in a society. So it's not that stories and metaphors are new, but I think at this moment in time, what's new is that we've convinced ourselves that we're too clever or clever enough to know the difference between stories, metaphors, and between objects and the real physical world. So as this loop starts to tighten, as we become, we're still not immune to the idea that, for example, a cloud can distract us from the environmental devastation that technological culture is inducing. Also, we're not beyond mistaking crystals for technologies that can heal the body, and we're also not beyond being completely wretched and disgusted by the idea of table salt having something to do with sweat. So I would submit and suggest that we're not quite as clever as we think we are, and that we're really in this dangerous space of constantly confusing metaphors for technologies, and that learning to tell the difference and being critical of that will only do us good and give us some distance on that loop that I'm worried is tightening to the point where we're going to continue to misrecognize those differences. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitchell. Remind me not to come over to your place for lunch. When we're talking about the limitations of metaphor, it reminds me of something that the philosopher of mind, John Searle, talked about when he was talking about the limitations of the metaphors, the technological metaphors that we use when we talk about the function of the mind. And he said that when he was little, the functioning of the brain was always compared to a telephone switchboard, and prior to that it had been compared to the telegraph system, and prior to that Leibniz had compared it to a mill, and now we compare it to computers. And Searle argues, that the reason that we were always using the latest technology as a metaphor for our minds and brains is because we really don't understand the brain very well. And in fact, in spite of all of our research and all our advances in artificial intelligence, we still have no idea how the activity we observe in the brain and the synapses in the neurons produces consciousness. So we rely on metaphor.